just be sure that we're real clear on some really basic stuff while we're talking about intervals. And looking at the symbols for notation. Um, and I'm sure you know all of this, but I just want to be absolutely positive. So this is, of course, the treble clef. Without a treble clef, those 5 lines and 4 spaces are meaningless. With the treble clef, then we know we have the spaces that spell the word face and the lines every good boy does fine. This, of course, is the bass clef, which give us the spaces all cows eat grass and the lines GBDFA, great big dreams for Americans. Something that we haven't mentioned, and honestly I'm not sure if it's in your reading, this symbol is actually called a brace. That's on the side that joins 2 staffs together. It can join any staffs. It could, they could both be treble clefs. But typically, when the brace is used, it's used to join the treble clef staff with the bass clef staff. And when that occurs, we've created the grand staff. And the grand staff is really important for notating the entire range of music. So a couple more things. These lines that separate, they're vertical and they go through the staff. These are called bar lines, and the space that's in between the bar lines is called a bar or a measure. Now these are used primarily for rhythm notation, which we haven't even started yet. But you probably already know this. If the music has 4 beats per measure, these are the bar lines that give us that organization and separate the music into manageable groups. Okay, the next thing I want to talk about, a couple things here. Let's talk about middle C again. Middle C, as I said in another lesson, I thought originally it was because it's in the middle of the piano. It's not. It's because it's in the middle of the grand staff. Now look down here on the bottom left side, and notice that middle C, it can be notated 2 ways. Right here it is middle C that is in the bass clef. Right here to the right of it, it's middle C that's in the treble clef. This is the same note. It doesn't matter how it's notated. It's the same pitch. It's that same white key on the piano keyboard. Okay? We don't traditionally write it exactly in the middle because it's confusing. This is very organized, and if you're playing piano, it's also helpful because a lot of beginners learn that, well, if it's down here, I play it with my left hand, and if it's up here, I play it with my right hand, and that's kind of true. Okay, so middle C. And now, ledger lines. All your exercises have stopped with the top line of the treble staff and the bottom line of the bass staff. So we need to move on. The range of music is much wider than that, and so we use ledger lines. So from the treble clef, the top line is F. Every good boy does fine. 1 note higher than, and it's sitting on top. I'm down here on the bottom right-hand corner of the screen now. It's sitting on top of the treble clef staff. That's the next note up. A second above F is G. And then we start adding ledger lines. Ledger lines are these little lines, and they're added above or below the staff to extend the staff so that we get the higher pitches and the lower pitches. So here are several ledger lines going up above the treble staff and then below it. They get pretty difficult to read depending on what instrument you play. If you're a violinist or you play flute, another high woodwind instrument like the oboe or clarinet, those musicians are pretty good at reading the really high ledger lines. And if you play a bass clef instrument like the double bass or the tuba, those folks get pretty good at reading down here. As beginners, it's kind of a pain. So more practice there to name notes with using ledger lines. We're going to use the piano keyboard now to work on intervals. As I said to you a week ago, the piano keyboard is a really, really important and useful tool in music theory. And I'll show you what I mean now as we begin working on intervals. So let's look at the white notes of the piano, and we're just going to look at the relationship or distance between two notes. So I'll stop right there and we'll talk about, what is an interval? In music, it's a unit of measurement. We measure everything. We measure distance by feet or meters. We measure liquids by ounces, gallons, or liters. We measure time, minutes and seconds, hours. So in music, we have a unit to measure the distance between two notes. That's what an interval is, the distance between two notes. And without that distance, without intervals, all we would have is rhythm. All music would sound very boring because we can't create melody until we use intervals. So we're going to begin with intervals this week, and we're working on analyzing them. Now there are two analyses of intervals. They all have a generic analysis or general size, and then they have a specific quality. The qualities are probably familiar to you already, the names of them. These are things like minor, major. Maybe not as familiar to you are qualities such as perfect, diminished, and augmented. So we're going to get to qualities later. We're going to start just what is called often the generic spelling, the generic size or general size of an interval. And actually, we've already worked on one of these. You worked on octaves. And remember, the octave gets its name from 8, like the stop sign, the octagon, like the octopus. But if you look at these two notes C, we're just going to count the notes in between them. 2 above the first note, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So this generic interval is an eighth or an octave. So let's use the white notes now, and we're just going to work on generic spellings. And using the piano keyboard, we can make this really simple. All right, so let's try this. I'm going to use Star Wars as an example, the main theme, and it begins with this interval, which is probably a really familiar sound to all of you. Okay, so what is that interval? The first note that I'm playing in this key is the note C, and the second note is G. So we just count. From C to D is 2, 3, up to E, 4 to F, and 5. So the first interval in Star Wars is up a fifth. So with that in mind now, let's look at all the intervals that are in the octave. To the very next note, remember last week we called that a whole step, is a second. And I'm going to show you also you can use the alphabet and do the same thing. This is a C, this is a D. CD is one step up in the alphabet, a second. Let's start here. This is a third. Up to F is a fourth. Here's our Star Wars interval again. A fifth. A sixth. Up a seventh. And an eighth. So far, I've shown you intervals that are all going from a low note to a high note. They're going on the piano keyboard from left to right, or ascending. Now, of course, melodies don't all go in that direction. Back to Star Wars, the first interval is ascending. But right after that first interval, the melody goes down. So it goes from a high note to a low note. But it doesn't matter what direction we move on the piano keyboard. We still count each key. Down is a second. They're right next to each other. Now, just a few more things. Intervals can go from a low note to a high note, or ascending. They can go from a high note to a low note, or descending. Now think about this for a minute. There's also several ways you can perform an interval besides low to high and high to low. And in music, quite often, if it's a melody, it's one note after another. And these are called melodic intervals. Melodic as in melody, one note after another. But if I add harmony to that, now I'm playing intervals, but I'm playing them at the same time. So when I play two notes at the same time, I'm playing an interval that is a harmonic interval. And then finally, we've done the second up to the octave. But if you play the same note and you play it twice, that's an interval also. Okay, and lots of melodies have repeated notes. You can't sing Happy Birthday without repeating the first note. So the interval from this note to this note is called a unison. It's the same note. In theory, it's a first or a prime, but most commonly we refer to it as a unison. Now, what about intervals that are larger than an octave? If this is an eighth, and we go one more note, it is a ninth, but this is called a compound interval. We're only going to work on intervals for now that are a unison through the eighth. It's compound because the ninth is really a second plus an octave. So let me review. From a low note up, just count the keys. C to D is 1, 2. It's a second. Or if you're going down, it's a third. Also, we talked about if you play one note after another, this is a melodic interval. If you play them at the same time, a harmonic interval. There it is.